So the last of my themes, which is violence, or violence, revolution and war, all the same kinds of things. We tend to think of violence as a bad thing, but for the futurists that wasn't necessarily the case. They think of it as tied up with change, transformation, as somehow enabling the new to come into existence. I mean, here's the thing, that we tend to think of art as a good thing, and modern art maybe is a good thing. It's taking us somewhere good. But I'm saying perhaps one should be wary of that idea. Maybe the futurists aren't the good guys. Maybe what they are suggesting is not necessarily something palatable to us. Modern art isn't just one thing, it's many different things. It proposes different solutions to our situation. Always, we're having to be evaluative and critical about everything that we come across. Let's think a bit about that. Boccioni, the riot in the Galleria, 1910. We've already seen the Galleria in Milan, this lovely bourgeois, shopping mall, high-end kind of place, have smart cafes and things. Now transformed by violence. But the idea is it could be something a bit positive. It's shaking up the old order. It's bringing something new. See the style, this sort of Seurat influenced divisionism, the pointillism, the broken brushwork that adds together to create a sense of greater luminosity, but perhaps for Boccioni in the future it's also a greater sense of dynamism. All these, it's a crowd, and they're made up of sort of bourgeois people. Look at this ladies with their enormous flowery hats and things, These are not ruffians from the street that have come in, and these are the bourgeoisie themselves are having a go at each other. An artwork that they liked, by one of the artists from the immediately preceding generation is this, The Fourth Estate by Pulitzer da Volpedo, 1901. It's a very large painting, so these figures within it are life-size figures. If you're in front of the painting, you could perhaps have a sense of kind of threat. Here is a large crowd, and they're not bourgeois ladies with flowery hats either. These are the working people. They're on strike, and they're all coming in your direction, directly out of the painting. So, imagine you're the bourgeois audience in an art exhibition, and you see all this. You're confronted with a sense of threat. Here's something that interested Boccioni. Russolo, Revolt, 1911, how to make a sort of abstract symbol of social transformation, of revolution. Again, it's the theme of the crowd. Large numbers of people together are capable of changing things. So he's showing people, but he's also producing something pushes you towards a more abstracted language just to try and talk about these things. It's against the backdrop of the modern city. You see all the windows of tall buildings. Everything is shoved topsy-turvy into this sort of diagonal shapes. Very dynamic at the level of visual form. Colour, of course, is very important. Red is this new hot energy coming in to transform things. It's like this sort of abstracted language used to represent motion, lines of force. So the same thing we're seeing here. Carlo Cara. Funeral of the Anarchist Galli, 1911. Actually, they have some sympathies especially towards the beginning, with anarchist thought, which was really very popular in the early part of the 20th century. Anarchism emphasizes individualism, and it emphasizes, getting rid of the state altogether, decentralizing power. All around it was very popular. Even it was a very important trend in Chinese radical thought. All that's been kind of eliminated in a way, retrospectively, by the Communist Party, because in the early part of the 20th century, communism was just one amongst various radical possibilities. But over time, the futurists become more conservative. They end up being, many of them, not all of them, but many of them become supporters of Italian fascism, the leader of which is Mussolini. Fascism was most famously there amongst the Nazis in Germany, Hitler and the Nazis, but also in Italy. And the idea of violence being a positive thing seems to get to carry up along with that. They didn't really like socialism. Socialism, Marinetti called socialism an ignoble exaltation of the rights of the belly. It's too materialistic, They disliked socialism because it was internationalistic, whereas they were very nationalistic. Fascism is ultimately incredibly nationalistic. That's its main tool to bind people, is to play with nationalist rhetoric. And so many, modern states, contemporary states, understand that. The Chinese government is a great manipulator of nationalist rhetoric. The idea, we have a dream, we're going forward, all this sort of thing, as a nation. Oh, yeah, sorry, just before we leave Rousseau, I just realised I have a quotation statement he made about this painting. He talks about the collision of two forces, that of the revolutionary element, made up of enthusiasm and red lyricism, against the forces of inertia and reactionary resistance to tradition. In some ways, Russolo is the most kind of programmatic illustrator of Marinetti's ideas in the original Futurist Manifesto. He had actually started off as a pacifist, but he sort of accepts Marinetti's views. Eventually, he reacts against it all and leaves Italy to escape fascism. So, Carlo Cara, the funeral of the anarchist Galli, and as I say, that they are associated to some extent with anarchism. Galli had been killed, the anarchists had been killed at a demonstration. This is not that demonstration. And his funeral, of course, became a political event. And the police ordered the ceremony to be held not in the cemetery but in the square in front. This caused bad feeling. A fight ensued, and Cara witnessed this, so it's a sort of first-hand representation. Kind of people rising up against the state in vengeance. People are holding spears or lances or something, and they're in motion. Again, we're back to the theme of movement. Bang, crash, trying to create a sense of the heat of a violent encounter. he reworked the painting. This is one of the works that's just on the cusp between the discovery of Cubism. So he reworked the painting a bit with this slightly more faceted, planar quality in the sky, for instance. That's a little bit of Cubism coming in. So we repainted it really for exhibition in Paris in 1911. So movement and violence coming together. And I think you're really trying to put the spectator into the heart of the action, giving us a viewpoint where we are really involved. A lot of these works we're looking at here, they're showing crowds of people. And the whole notion of the crowd and crowd psychology was a particular concern at that time. There was a writer called George Simmel who wrote on the psychology of the crowd. He wrote an essay in 1903 called The Metropolis and Mental Life. His idea is, living in cities, we're all pushed together. It affects the way our whole mode of existence and how we think and feel. And so you have crowd phenomenons that you could never have in agricultural village life. We're all aware of how crowds almost seem to take on an emotional quality of their own. People act in a crowd in ways that they wouldn't act as individuals in certain situations. You can easily get carried away as part of a large group. The emotion of the crowd. Sociologists would be very interested in exploring all this sort of thing, and Simmel really is the first, I suppose. So, I think Cara picks it up. There's also an idea from a writer called Jules Romans. He has a notion of Unionism, talking about sort of collective experience or something beyond the individual. All of these things may be in the air at this time. A purely visual source could be this one, going back to the Renaissance, and of course they're Italians, they're aware of their own country's visual history, even if they're more or less against the past in any way. I think there is an influence from Uccello's The Rout of San Romano. The idea of representing violence is not entirely new. That there are battle paintings through the history of art. Even on Angkor Wat Temple in Cambodia, battle scenes or whatever. There's something almost modern about Uccello, the kind of geometricized treatment of the hat and things like that. It's all, and of course the lances relate to these forms here in this painting, and the horizontal nature of the composition. So Uccello's The Rout of San Romano. But then very quickly, Cara has changed his style to this. This is really very post-Cubist. And it's reliant on one of the major innovations of Cubism, which is collage, including stacked elements from magazines or newspapers onto the final surface, alongside painted marks as well. So very sort of turbulent sort of feel to the whole image. It's a vortex of energy, mixing different things, paper glued on card, tempera, pen, mica powder, different elements that he's using. 1914 is the date of the work. That's the date of the outbreak of the First World War, so the big sort of transforming moment of the old European order. A lot of things change in the war, and that whole time is such a time of social change. So violence and social change go together. Obviously, the most famous event to happen during the 1914-18 war as regards major social change would be the Russian Revolution of 1917. We'll have things to say about Russian art later on. There's the fall of the Qing dynasty just before 1911 to 1912, the beginning of the Chinese Republic. There's the fall of the Ottoman Empire, pretty much around the same time. The birth of the secular Turkish Republic under Ataturk. He's sort of the Turkish Sun Yat-sen, if you like, the kind of father of his country. It's a pretty close parallel in a way. A kind of multinational empire breaks down. So it really is, those few years really are a time of great change. This is sometimes called interventionist demonstration or patriotic celebration. Slightly different titles are given, especially in English translation. Patriotic holiday. It was created just after the event which sparked the First World War, that is the assassination by a Yugoslavian nationalist of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. So the leader of the Austro-Hungarian, major figure of the Austro-Hungarian ruling family. It happened in Sarajevo in June 1914, 28th of June 1914. And that's the event which led to the First World War about a month later on the 28th of July 1914. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, a very powerful empire, declared war on Serbia. They held the Serbian as responsible for the assassination. Italy was supposed to be on the same side as Austria and Germany as part of a triple alliance, but in fact it didn't join in with them, I suppose because Austria-Hungary had taken the offensive, rather than being themselves under attack. A little bit later on, Italy joins the other side, that is the Russians, the British and the French, and they do that in April 1915, the Treaty of London, and then they declare war on Austro-Hungarian Empire, trying to get some of the land that they had occupied in Italy. Like the Italian city of Trieste was originally part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. I think their army goes about 10 miles into the Austro-Hungarian territory, and then they're forced back. They wait until they think they know who's going to win the war before they join, I think. But then, even so, it doesn't go well for them. And 600,000 Italians killed and 950,000 wounded. This is just normal in the First World War. Mechanized warfare suddenly. Mechanized warfare also, it's warfare. At one point in the past, warfare was conducted on battlefields by armies, but by the First World War, you're starting to see the whole civilian population are somehow involved with warfare too, either because it's a battle between two economies ultimately, who can afford to put up with the privations of war and finance the weaponry of war, but also because the war travels by air and so forth to where civilians are, and long distance guns and so forth. So this is the moment when Italy had not yet decided whether it should be part of the war, and so Cara is part of this nationalist camp that's trying to call for Italy to intervene, to take sides. So it's pro-war. It's very common at that time for people to think that somehow war would be a sort of cleansing thing, that a dead old society needed somehow a revitalization, that war would be a kind of sort of hygiene that would clean things up and bring things back to life, almost like pruning a plant to make it grow, something like that. In the 1909 Futurist Manifesto, Marinetti said, "We wish to glorify war, sole hygiene of the world." And several of the futurists died in this war. Boccioni and Santalia were both killed. They were, they'd all volunteered to be part of it all. Many of the paper cuttings here used in this piece are from a literary periodical called La Serba. This ODOL is from a toothpaste advertisement in a newspaper. I think it's kind of evoking just the turmoil of war. There's Italian national flags, of course, but I think you're also you're almost getting the sounds as well, evoking other senses than purely visual. It's also got collage in it. You see here newspaper elements. This is Boccioni, The Charge of the Lancers, 1915. The grey tonality again is a sense of cubism, collage and monochrome. Horses again, we've seen quite a lot of horses. Cavalry charge. That's a kind of mode of warfare that was just at the end of disappearing, really, by that point in time. If someone goes out, can you pull the door like that so it's shut when you come back? Almost shut, but still people can come in because of the noise outside. So cavalry charge, there was a point in history where that was a terribly frightening thing, a whole bunch of people on horseback with lances or whatever coming at you. That would be almost like an ultimate battlefield weapon. But of course, after machine guns come along, the whole thing is changed somewhat. So it's on the verge of being an anachronistic image of war. And I think the real reason why he's chosen cavalry charge is because that philosopher I mentioned, Henri Bergson, makes the cavalry charge a kind of key metaphor in a certain point in his writing in a book called Creative Evolution. I'll quote you what he says. So I'm suggesting maybe this is partly it's about war. They were living and fighting in war themselves, but by the point in time this was made, 1915. But it's also about something larger. So for Bergson, life is like a cavalry charge, the energy of life over the deadness of matter. He has this sort of dualistic, vitalistic philosophy. All organized beings, from the humblest to the highest, from the first origins of life to the time in which we are, and in all places and in all times, do but evidence a single impulsion, the inverse of the movement of matter, and in itself indivisible. All the living hold together, and all yield to the same tremendous push. The animal takes its stand on the plant, man bestriding animality, talking about evolution here, and the whole of humanity in space and time is one immense army galloping beside and before and behind, each of us in an overwhelming charge, able to bat down every resistance and to clear many obstacles, perhaps even death. So that's his kind of big metaphor. Severini, Armoured Train, 1915. So, we already seen that the railway station and the railway engines are kind of popular subjects for the futurists, but here that subject comes back in a wartime vein. Again, it's a positive image of war. War as the ultimate futurist subject even. Marinetti wrote to Severini urging him, in his own words, this is quoting, to try to live the war pictorially, studying it in all its marvellous mechanical forms, military trains, fortifications, wounded men, ambulances, hospitals, parades, etc. But a few years later, after the war, this is what Severini is doing. And actually this is kind of like looking ahead to a theme that will come back again. Modernist experimentation, formal development of new formal language, it's not something that just kind of proceeds forward and forward in a linear way through the whole 20th century. In the 1920s and 30s, a lot of artists go back to more realistic styles. It's not just that realistic styles are more popular, but the same artists often are going back to more realistic styles. Now, this includes even Picasso and Matisse. They also went back to slightly less avant-garde modes. Of course, they didn't go all the way back. There was no complete going back. Realism was never the same. Once you realize it's just one way of making art, you can't go back to the way things were before. But it's still available as one possible mode. And maybe after all the turmoil of war, it's kind of natural that there's a slight sort of retrenching going on once you realize how horrific that all that destruction was. So here is Severini in the post-war period. Sometimes this is called a return to order. That's a phrase from the writer Jean Cocteau to describe this sort of tendency to return to classicism even, a more calm, ordered world. Instead of direct expression, things are sort of hidden away behind masks and so forth. 1916, this is actually during the wartime period itself. It's only a year after the armoured train painting with its cubist-derived vocabulary. This is very conservative in style. It's also conservative in subject matter too. Woman's role is as the mother of children. The very sort of conservative notion of women's place in society. During wartime, women actually were taking all kinds of new jobs. Same thing happened in the Second World War. Because the men were off fighting, women were doing so-called men's jobs, for the first time maybe, gaining all kinds of independence out of the home. That's an era of the suffragettes and so forth, that whole early 20th century period of women striving for the vote and everything. So in the context of all that, this is a somewhat conservative statement, implicitly at least. Or it's reference back to religious art, Madonnas and Childs and so forth. Carlo Carra too, in the post-war period, goes back to some more realist notion. It's not completely realism. It's almost like a sort of naivety of a early Renaissance artist. It's a slightly pre-Giotto feel about it. It can't belong to any other century than the 20th century. It's got a strange kind of mood to it, but a sort of naive kind of magical kind of feel somehow. But anyway, it's a different vocabulary from that very fragmented vocabulary, the Cubist vocabulary. Good. So that's Cubism for you. We just have a bit of time to start looking at the work of Kandinsky. So it's a big shift now towards the theme of abstract art, which will take up our attention for a little bit of time before we move on to other things like expressionism. I'm going to pick out, one thing I would say that there are many different starting points for abstract art. There's no one single route to abstraction. There's no one founding father of abstract art. So it's interesting to look at different artists and see their different ways they found through to abstraction. I can't really do it for all of them, so I'm picking two to go look at in more detail, and that is Kandinsky and Mondrian. And then we'll also look at other abstract art produced in Russia. Kandinsky is a Russian artist, but I'll look at him in isolation, and then I'll look at Russian art before and during and after the time of the Russian Revolution, looking at how art gets tied up with those social changes. The first socialist revolution of the modern world. Sometimes abstract art is thought of as just abandoning subject matter. It's just art that's concerned only with form. Sometimes the whole of modern art is thought of as that kind of a story. In the 19th century people painted things, and then gradually it became more and more abstract. Cubism is pretty hard to work out what the things are sometimes. And then abstract art is like the ultimate attainment of becoming purely formalistic, purely about shapes and colours and everything, and no subject matter, recognizable subject matter at all. I think that's far too simplistic as an overall story of modern art. As I've just been saying, in the 20s and 30s and even in 40s, a lot of artists went back to more realistic styles. But it's not even a good enough story to explain abstract art itself, because I think the pioneers of abstract art were often really concerned with content. They weren't concerned much with literal everyday subject matter of the kind found in realist art, but they were still concerned with meaning, with content in a larger sense, and I think that should become clear. They just felt, as the Futurists did in their own way, the need to have a new language to express their concerns about meaning. And very often, and this is definitely the case for Kandinsky, those meanings were to do with spirituality. In the face of the challenges of modernity, many people have taken a sort of spiritual retreat from materialism and tried to find some new perspective in that way. Kandinsky and other abstract artists are part of that story. It was in a slightly different way. The language of abstraction will be very, very different. The route to abstraction will be very, very different. But that concern with spirituality is there for Mondrian as well. So a Russian artist Kandinsky and then the Dutch artist Mondrian that we'll look at. Those are the two individual cases where we really follow through their route to abstraction and see, how did they find their way there. Another thing about abstraction I want to say is that in some sense, even before there was abstract art, there was a kind of place that had been cleared for it to exist. In that, in the late 19th century, there was already a lot of talk and theorizing by artists and others from the art world about how you could express feelings, say, through shapes and colours alone, through forms alone, that you didn't need literal subject matter. So you get, in the idea of the painter Maurice Denis, the concept that, the most important thing about a painting is shapes and colours arranged in a certain order on a flat surface. That's what a painting is. And only secondarily is it a nude woman, or horse or a landscape or whatever, those things are kind of less important. So once you've got that idea that the most important thing about a painting is the shapes and colours, it's only actually a fairly small step really to get to the stage where, okay, then maybe we don't need the nude woman or the horse or whatever at all. We could just have the shapes and colours if they're not actually central. How about we try and eliminate them altogether? So in that sense, the theoretical possibility of abstract art had already been created. It was almost sort of waiting to happen, you could say, because the abstract elements of art had already been emphasized over the others. Another thing would be to say, well, maybe there are other artistic traditions in the world where representation never was so important as it was in the Western Renaissance tradition. You know, one reason for that interest in making very realistic sense of the presence of figures is sort of tied to Christianity, you know, to creating a certain kind of religious art. Christianity is based around the idea of a God becoming a man, becoming tangible in the world. So the idea of making images as if you could make it, as if those holy figures are there right in front of you, getting the tangibility of religious experience. It fits in very well with Christianity. But in other religious traditions, maybe the same is not true. So in Jewish art, for instance, or in Islamic art, there is much less emphasis on representation and something of a taboo, of course, on representing God directly. You know, in Christian art, there's plenty of God the Fathers as old men in white beards and all that kind of thing, let alone the representation of Jesus as a God that becomes human. But in Islam or Judaism, you don't have an equivalent. And actually, Kandinsky was aware of the other tradition, those other traditions. So, that's one small part of the whole story of how it becomes possible to move to abstract art. The title of the course I taught on the previous semester is Vision in Crisis. You know, it's part of that crisis is the sense that you're aware of other cultures and their ways of representing the world. The relativity is as an essential part of modern experience, that there's no one right way of doing things, and that applies to art too. You're aware that other cultures do things differently, so somehow you have a choice about how you're doing it, because your own way of doing it is now dethroned from the central place it had. So, for instance, as regards Islamic art, we know that Kandinsky went to Tunisia in 1904, very impressed by the Islamic kind of decorations he saw there, and he told his partner Gabriel Munter that objects disturbed him. You know, this is several years before he produced himself any abstract art, but he sort of moving beyond the world of things, perhaps inspired by an art that doesn't so directly represent things. You know, a lot of Islamic art relies on geometric pattern, for instance, wonderful, rich visual culture without having to resort to realistic representation all the time. The other thing is scientific worldview changing. You know, maybe in 17th century science, someone looks down a microscope or looks through a telescope and tries to see what they've seen there in great detail. The science of someone like Bacon is about observation, something that the eye, or the eye aided by those lenses. But by the turn of the 20th century, science seems to move away from the visual. It's starting to talk about things that not only can the human eye not see, but even in principle it can't see. You would never be able to see even with the most powerful optical microscope or telescope that you could imagine. So even science is somehow moving away from everyday visual experience, the world that physics, for instance, is starting to describe is a world that very different from our commonsensical understanding of reality. So there's an undermining of the world of things. If even science is not talking about the world of everyday things anymore, why should artists have to stay with all that themselves, you know? And again, there's a link to Kandinsky. You know, he said at some point that when he heard about the splitting of the atom, it was like a kind of breaking of the fundamental, a sort of fundamental shock to him. You know, things that he thought were the solid building blocks of matter, the atom. Even that is not solid now. So everything is dissolving. There's nothing to grasp even at that basic level of building blocks. You can't, find anything to hold on to. So I'm mentioning spirituality. Of course, there's a great language available for representing the spiritual in art. In all the great religions have their different ways, and in the West, the Christian religion, a great history of Christian art. But maybe at a certain point that doesn't feel an appropriate language, and that's already, you can say, has happened. Say in the 19th century, a lot of the expression of spiritual feeling in the Romantic era would happen, say, through representing a landscape, but imbuing that landscape with a certain spiritual feeling. This could be the art of Turner or the art of Friedrich. They didn't want to use traditional religious iconography. You know, landscape painting had never been created for that kind of purpose. In 17th century Holland, it wasn't used for that kind of purpose. But in 19th century Germany or Britain, you start to see the notion of the sublime or something coming up with landscape painting as a way of expressing spiritual feeling. So you could look at abstract art as part of that story of trying to explore new fields of where you can express better something you've tried already that other people have tried already to deal with in their own way. So, Kandinsky. He has some realistic landscapes represented from the real world around. This is Amsterdam, view from the window, 1904. Nothing particularly original about this. I'd like to go back to very early works of an artist, because I think often that's where you can see the sources of their style, the influences on their style betrayed before they found their own individual personality. So I'm going to take that approach here. But perhaps more typical of his early work, more individual in its characteristics, is something like this, The Couple Riding. This is 1906 to 7. A lot of the works he produced at this time are works on cardboard, so actually basically paper rather than on canvas, and use the medium of tempera rather than oil painting. And rather than being works where he's working from reality, these are works where he's working more from imagination or from folklore, from stories, often set in the past. So you can see it's almost like a tale of sort of knightly adventure or something like that. You know, couple on horseback. There's a river, and behind is a kind of walled city, a Kremlin, I think would be the Russian term for it. We talk about the Kremlin, but a Kremlin is a walled city. Whoops. It's interesting to look at some of the subject matter of these earlier works, because the subject matter will come back in his later, more abstracted paintings, but in a slightly different way. we're more able to recognize it if we've seen the early works. So moving away from realism, moving more towards imagination, drawing on folklore. He was fascinated by folklore and folk beliefs. He was joined a kind of expedition, a kind of ethnographic expedition to the region Volga, a remote province where they were kind of investigating the culture of the people there, peasant handicrafts. All that kind of peasant culture was disappearing because of modern life. And when something's on the verge of disappearing, that's just the moment that you become interested in it. Like you become interested in old buildings just when they're being knocked down, or hopefully just before rather than just after. But sorry, often it's too late. It also relates, I think, to the language of end-of-century book illustrations. Here's one example. In illustration, you're allowed to simplify and break away from realism a little bit more than your average oil painting is expected to be. Also, maybe the stage decorations in Russia at the time. Leo Bax was one famous who did these things. So quite a decorative style, a lot of colour, anti-naturalistic colour, non-naturalistic colour, foreshadows his later works. The dot-like touch that everything is built up from, of course, it kind of relates back to Seurat yet again. So many artists were influenced by Seurat, and again, so many artists actually don't use Seurat's technique the way it was originally designed to be used. They use it in a kind of decorative way, or to create a kind of dynamism like the Futurists did, making the dots more visible. But it all sort of goes back to Seurat, which had a kind of, it was a sort of systematization of the broken brushwork of Impressionism, the visible touch of the Impressionists. There's also a kind of interesting positive, negative thing going on here. The background colour is quite dark, you see, and then lighter colours are placed on top of it. So, do you see what I'm trying to say? The way that the horse is only defined by these sort of dots of colour on the foreground. He's doing quite a lot of woodblock prints at this time. Maybe he's influenced by his working in that medium, where when you're making a woodblock print, you're carving away the bit that's that represents the image most of the time, and the bit that has the ink would be the background usually. So you're thinking a lot when you're making a woodblock print. When you're carving the block, you're thinking in positive, negative terms. What's going to be, what I'm concentrating on is the thing that won't be there. You're thinking in that kind of positive, negative way. So maybe that's infected his approach to painting too. And it's a good thing anyway to think about the negative spaces, isn't it? If you're working as an artist, you've got to think about what is not there as well as what is there. So it all helps to unify the surface. Background and foreground, figure and ground are kind of merged and blurred and jump one from the other. But I want to emphasize that this is really, this choice to go towards the imagination, it's a very particular choice to make. There are various sources he can use to do that. I've talked about that. But at the same time, another source would be Russian folk prints. Lubok, L-U-B-O-K is the word for them, or the plural is L-U-B-K-I. Those were influential, I think, in providing a visual language for him. But a very dominant strain in Russian art of that late 19th century was the realist strain. And the most famous of those artists was Repin. And the most famous of his paintings is this one, the Volga Barge haulers. So, here is art that's concerned with social problems, reality, It's a very different orientation to going into the world of imagination and fantasy fairy tale land. So I want you to have a sense of this being a kind of choice that he's having to make amongst different options. He's very late taking up art. He's about 30 before he really takes art as a profession. Before that, he was on his way to be a lawyer. He was very successful. He taught law. He turned down a professorship in law and then came to Munich in 1896 to study. Russians had to go to other places sometimes to get their art training, and Munich was one of the nearest. Just finished to show you one or two other of these early works. So this is the Mirror, 1907. Again, you get this strong sense of positive and negative. This is a woodblock print.
Oh, is there like landscape in the mirror, like mountains and?
A good question. I don't really know. I don't really know the answer. We'd have to try and work out if there's a particular narrative that this relates to, and if so, then that might help us as a way in. Yeah. I mean, if I was the artist, I really want to emphasize the landscape, I think I would make it a bit more clear than that. If it was so important for the image. Yeah. But I think it's a little bit similar to what we're seeing here, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's enough. I've kept you a little bit late, but some of you arrived a little bit late. So, okay, thanks very much.